The backstage hallway at Carnegie Hall. 1962. Two men in tuxedos, standing 6 feet apart under fluorescent lights. One of them had just sold out Madison Square Garden 3 nights in a row. The other had just recorded Georgia on My Mind. Between them, more awards than either could count, more records sold than either could remember. Frank Sinatra put his hand on Ray Charles's shoulder, the way Frank Sinatra put his hand on very few people's shoulders, and said it clearly, without ceremony, without qualification, "You are the only genius in this business." The hallway went quiet. Ray Charles turned toward him, dark glasses, quiet smile, the kind of smile that meant he had already thought this through completely. "Frank," he said, "you're wrong." Sinatra stared. He was not a man accustomed to being contradicted. Certainly not in a backstage hallway. Certainly not by someone he had just called the only genius in the business. "Then who is?" Sinatra said. Ray Charles said a name, and Frank Sinatra never forgot it. To understand why Ray Charles said what he said that night, you have to understand what the word genius meant to him, and what it cost him to hear it applied to himself. Ray Charles had been called many things by 1962. Talented, innovative, groundbreaking. He had taken gospel music and stripped it to its bones. He had taken the blues and rebuilt it from the inside out. But genius was different. Genius implied something finished, something complete, something that existed independent of other people. And Ray Charles did not believe in singular flames. He believed in rooms. He believed that music was never one person. It was always a conversation, always a debt, always a chain of people reaching back through time towards someone who came before them. So when Frank Sinatra said, "You are the only genius in this business," Ray Charles heard something underneath the compliment that most people would have missed. He heard the word "only," and that was the word he couldn't let stand. "Art Tatum," he said. The hallway was very quiet for a moment. Art Tatum was a jazz pianist who had died 5 years earlier, blind almost from birth. No formal training worth mentioning. What he had instead was a technical command of the piano so complete, so total, so far beyond what anyone else was doing, that musicians who heard him for the first time sometimes walked out of the room. Not because they didn't like it, because they needed a moment alone. Vladimir Horowitz, one of the greatest classical pianists who ever lived, heard Art Tatum play once and said he felt ashamed to call himself a pianist. Oscar Peterson said Tatum made him want to quit. Fats Waller, when he saw Tatum walk into a club one night, announced to the audience, "I play piano, but God is in the house tonight." Ray Charles had discovered Art Tatum as a teenager, learning to read Braille music in the Florida School for the Deaf and Blind. He had listened to Tatum's recordings until he had memorized every note, every run, every harmonic choice. He didn't try to imitate him. He knew that was impossible. What he tried instead was to understand the thinking behind the playing, the architecture, the logic of a mind that heard music in a way no one else did. Art Tatum was the genius, Ray Charles told Sinatra. "I'm just a man who learned from a genius. There's a difference." Frank Sinatra was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded, slowly, the way he nodded when something landed. "I heard Tatum once," he said. 1941. Small club on 52nd Street. I couldn't move for 20 minutes after. That's what genius does, Ray Charles said. It stops you. It makes you feel like you've been missing something your whole life and you just found it. That's not me, Frank. That might be you, but it's not me. Sinatra laughed, a real laugh, not a performed one. You're the most modest, immodest man I've ever met, he said. I'm not modest, Ray Charles said. I'm accurate. The people who knew Ray Charles well said this wasn't unusual. He had spent his entire life giving credit outward, to the musicians who came before him, to the teachers who shaped him, to the music itself, which he talked about as if it were a living thing that existed independently of the people who played it. His pianist Hank Crawford said that Ray Charles never once took sole credit for an arrangement. If a horn line worked, he would say it worked because of the player. If a chord progression landed, he would say it landed because of the song. He genuinely believed, Crawford said, that the music was smarter than any of us. We were just trying to keep up with it. But there was one more thing Ray Charles said that night, after the conversation about Art Tatum, after the laugh, almost to himself. The publicist nearby nearly missed it. The real tragedy, Ray Charles said, is that Art Tatum never heard himself the way we heard him. He knew he was good, but he didn't know he was that. And now it's too late to tell him. Sinatra said nothing for a moment. Does that bother you? Not knowing how good you are? Ray Charles smiled, the same slow smile from before. I know exactly how good I am, he said. I'm just not the best, and knowing that keeps me moving. Frank Sinatra went home that night and did something unusual. He pulled out Art Tatum's records, all of them, and listened through the night. His valet, George Jacobs, wrote later that Sinatra didn't go to sleep until 6 in the morning, that he sat in his living room alone in the dark, listening to a dead man play piano. Art Tatum never won a Grammy. He never received a presidential medal. He played in small clubs for much of his life, in rooms that were often half empty, for people who sometimes didn't understand what they were hearing. He died at 47 years old, with very little money, and very little recognition outside the world of jazz. But on a night in 1962, in a backstage hallway at Carnegie Hall, a man who had sold out Madison Square Garden 3 nights running stood under fluorescent lights and listened to Ray Charles say a dead man's name. And Frank Sinatra went home and listened all night. There's always somebody better, Ray Charles said once, late in his life. That's the whole point of music. The minute you think you've arrived, you've already started going backward. If this story moved you, if you believe that artists who stand for something deserve to be remembered, subscribe. Because next week we have another Ray Charles story, and it's even harder to believe.